Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 All right, so you can start reading from text 28. How are you reading? You're reading from the computer, right?
No, I got the book.
You got the book, okay.
Tatvatu mohabaho guna karma vibhagayo guna gunyeshu vartanta iti matvana sachyate. Translation. One who is in knowledge of the absolute truth, almighty armed, does not engage himself in the senses and sense gratification, knowing well the difference between work in devotion and work for fruitive results. Purport. The knower of the absolute truth is convinced of his awkward position in material association. He knows that he is part and parcel of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, and that his position should not be in the material creation. He knows his real identity as part and parcel of the Supreme, who is internal bliss and knowledge, and he realizes that somehow or other he is entrapped in the material conception of life. In his pure state of existence, he is meant to dovetail his activities in devotional service to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna. He therefore engages himself in the activities of Krishna consciousness and becomes naturally unattached to the activities of the material senses, which are all circumstantial and temporary. He knows that his material condition of life is under the supreme control of the Lord. Consequently, he is not disturbed by all kinds of material reactions, which he considers to be the mercy of the Lord. According to Srimad Bhagavatam, one who knows the absolute truth in three different features, namely Brahman, Paramatma, and the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is called Tattvavid, for he knows also his own actual position in relationship with the Supreme. Text 29. Prakter guna samudhah sajyante guna karmasu tan akritna vidomadam kritsna vimna vichalayet. Translation. Bewildered by the modes of material nature, the ignorant fully engage themselves in material activities and become attached. But the wise should not unsettle them, although these duties are inferior due to the performer's lack of knowledge. Purport. Persons who are unknowledgeable falsely identify with gross material consciousness and are full of material designations. This body is a gift of the material nature, and one who is too much attached to the bodily consciousness is called manda, or a lazy person without understanding of spirit soul. Ignorant men think of the body as the self. They accept bodily connections with others as kinsmanship. The land in which the body is obtained is their object of worship, and they consider the formalities of religious rituals to be ends of themselves. Social work, nationalism, and altruism are some of the activities for such materially designated persons. Under the spell of such designations, they are always busy in the material field. For them, spiritual realization is a myth, and so they are not interested. Those who are enlightened in spiritual life, however, should not try to agitate such materially engrossed persons. Better to prosecute one's own spiritual activities silently. Such bewildered persons may be engaged in such primary moral principles of life as non-violence and similar materially benevolent work. Men who are ignorant cannot appreciate activities in Krishna consciousness, and therefore Lord Krishna advises us not to disturb them and simply waste valuable time. But the devotees of the Lord are more kind than the Lord because they understand the purpose of the Lord. Consequently, they undertake all kinds of risks, even to the point of approaching ignorant men to try to engage them in the acts of Krishna consciousness, which are absolutely necessary for the human being.
All right, so you can hold that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Guru Prabhupada, look at my businesses, bless the Prabhupada, and you can continue from text 30.
Hare Krishna Prabhuji, please accept my humble obeisances, all glory to Srila Prabhupada. Text 30. Mai sarvani karmani sannyasyaadhyatma cetasa nirashir nirmamo bhutva yudhyasva vigata jwaraha. Therefore, O Arjun, surrendering all your works unto me, with full knowledge of me, without desires for profit, with no claims to proprietorship, and free from lethargy, fight. Purport. This verse clearly indicates the purpose of the Bhagavad Gita. The Lord instructs that one has to become fully Krishna conscious to discharge duties as if in military discipline. Such an injunction may make things a little difficult. Nevertheless, duties must be carried out with dependence on Krishna, because that is the constitutional position of the living entity. The living entity cannot be happy independent of the cooperation of the Supreme Lord, because the eternal constitutional position of the living entity is to become subordinate to the desires of the Lord. Arjun was therefore ordered by Shri Krishna to fight as if the Lord were his military commander. One has to sacrifice everything for the good will of the Supreme Lord, and at the same time discharge prescribed duties without claiming proprietorship. Arjun did not have to consider the order of the Lord, he had only to execute his order. The Supreme Lord is the soul of all souls. Therefore, one who depends solely and wholly on the Supreme Soul without personal consideration, or in other words, one who is fully Krishna conscious, is called Adhyatma Chetas. Nirashihi means that one has to act on the order of the master but should not expect figurative results. The cashier may count millions of dollars for his employer, but he does not claim a cent for himself. Similarly, one has to realize that nothing in the world belongs to any individual person, but that everything belongs to the Supreme Lord. That is the real that is the real purport of my or unto me. And when one acts in such Krishna consciousness, certainly he does not claim proprietorship over anything. This consciousness is called nirmama, or nothing is mine. And if there is any reluctance to execute such a stern order, which is without consideration of so-called kinsmen in the bodily relationship, that reluctance should be thrown off. In this way, one may become Vijata Jwara, or without feverish mentality or lethargy. Everyone, according to his quality and position, has a particular type of work to discharge, and all such duties may be discharged in Krishna consciousness as described above. That will lead one to the path of liberation. Text 31. Ye me matam idam nityam anutishtanti manavaye श्रद्धावन्तो नासूयन्तो मुच्यन्ते तेऽपि कर्मभिः. Those persons who execute their duties according to my injunctions and who follow this teaching faithfully without envy become free from bondage of figurative actions. Purport. The injunction of the Supreme Personality of Godhead Krishna is the essence of all Vedic wisdom, and therefore is eternally true without exception. As the Vedas are eternal, so this truth of Krishna consciousness is also eternal. One should have firm faith in this injunction without envying the Lord. There are many philosophers who write comments on the Bhagavad Gita but have no faith in Krishna. They will never be liberated from the bondage of figurative action. But an ordinary man with firm faith in the eternal injunctions of the Lord, even though unable to execute such orders, becomes liberated from the bondage of the law of karma. In the beginning of Krishna consciousness, one may not fully discharge the injunctions of the Lord. But because one is not resentful of this principle and works sincerely without consideration of defeat and hopelessness, he will surely be promoted to the stage of pure Krishna consciousness. Text 32. Ye tva etad abhyasuyanto nanu tishthanti me matam sarva jnana vimuddham stan vidhi nashtan achetasah. But those who out of envy disregard these teachings and do not follow them regularly are to be considered bereft of all knowledge, befooled, and ruined in their endeavors for perfection. Purport. The flaw of not being Krishna conscious is clearly stated herein. As there is punishment for disobedience to the order of the Supreme Executive Head, so there is certainly punishment for disobedience to the order of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. A disobedient person, however great he may be, is ignorant of his own self and of the Supreme Brahman, Paramatma, and the Personality of Godhead, due to a vacant heart. Therefore, there is no hope of perfection of life for him. Text 33. Sadrisham cheshthate swasyah prakrite jnanavan api prakritim yanti bhutani nigraha kim karishyati. Even a man of knowledge acts according to his own nature, for everyone follows the nature he has acquired from the three modes. What can repression accomplish? Purport. Unless one is situated on the transcendental platform of Krishna consciousness, he cannot get free from the influence of the modes of material nature, as it is confirmed by the Lord in the 7th chapter, chapter 7, text 14. Therefore, even for the most highly educated person of the mundane plane, it is impossible to get out of the entanglement of Maya simply by theoretical knowledge, or by separating the soul from the body. There are many so-called spiritualists who outwardly pose as advanced in the science, but inwardly or privately are completely under particular modes of nature, which they are unable to surpass. Academically, one may be very learned, but because of his long association with material nature, he is in bondage. Krishna consciousness helps one to get out of the material entanglement, even though one may be engaged in his prescribed duties in terms of material existence. Therefore, without being fully in Krishna consciousness, one should not give up his occupational duties. No one should suddenly give up his prescribed duties and become a so-called yogi or transcendentalist artificially. It is better to be situated in one's position and to try to attain Krishna consciousness under superior training. Thus one may be freed from the clutches of Krishna's Maya. Text 34. Indriyas yendriya.
You can hold there, Prabhu. I'm sorry. All right, Raghunandan, please have my businesses. Glory to Prabhupada. And you can continue, Prabhu, with text 34.
Haribo, Prabhuji, please accept my humble obeisances. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.
Jai,
And
glory.
that text 24?
34.
Oh, 34. Okay. Because I wasn't following, I just...
It should be on your...
now. Text
Go ahead.
34?
34, 3-4.
Okay, thank you. Okay. All right. Please accept my humble obeisances. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Indriyas, yendriyas, yati, raga devasu, uyavas hito, tayuna vasam agachahi, tohi asya paripan inu. Translation. There are principles to regulate attachment and aversion pertaining to the senses and the objects. One should not come under the control of such attachment and aversion because they are stumbling blocks on the path of self-realization. Purport. Those who are in Krishna consciousness are naturally reluctant to engage in material sense gratification. But those who are not in such consciousness should follow the rules and regulations of revealed scripture. Unrestricted sense enjoyment is the cause of material engagement. But one who follows the rules and regulations of the revealed scriptures does not become entangled by the sense object. For example, sex enjoyment is a necessity for the conditioned soul, and sex enjoyment is allowed under the license of marriage ties. According to scriptural injunction, one is forbidden to engage in sex relationship with any woman other than one's wife. All other women are to be considered as one's mother. But in spite of such injunctions, a man is still inclined to have sex relationship with other women. These propensities are to be curbed, otherwise they will be stumbling blocks on the path of self-realization. As long as the material body is there, the necessities of the material body are allowed. But under rules and regulations, and yet we should not rely upon the control of such allowances. One has to follow those rules and regulations unattached to them, because practice of sense gratification under regulations may also lead one to go astray. As much as there is always the chance of an accident, even on the royal roads, although there may be very carefully maintained, no one can guarantee that there will be no danger, even on the safest road. The sense enjoyment spirit has been current a very long time, owing it to material association. Therefore, in spite of regulated sense enjoyment, there is every chance of falling down. Therefore, any attachment for regulated sense enjoyment must also be avoided by all means. But attachment to Krishna consciousness, or acting always in the loving service of the Lord, in the loving service of Krishna, detaches one from all kinds of sensory activity. Therefore, no one should try to be detached from Krishna consciousness at any stage of life. The whole purpose of detachment from all kinds of sense attachment is ultimately to become situated on the platform of Krishna consciousness. Text 35. Shriyan Swadamo Viguna Paradamatsu Anushitita Swadami Nitranam Shriya Paradamu Bhayavaha. Translation. It is far better to discharge one's prescribed duties even though faulty than other duties perfectly. Destruction in the course of performing one's own duties better than engaging in others' duties for to follow others' path is dangerous. Purport. One should therefore discharge his prescribed duties in full Krishna consciousness rather than those prescribed for others. Materially prescribed duties are duties enjoyed according to one's psychophysical condition under the spell of the moons of material nature. Spiritual duties are ordered by the spiritual master for the transcendental service of Krishna. But whether material or spiritual, one should stick to his prescribed duties even up to death, rather than imitate another's prescribed duty. Duties on the spiritual platform and duties on the material platform may be different, but the principles of following the authorized direction is always good for the performer. When one is under the spell of the moods of material nature, one should follow the prescribed rules for his particular situation and should not imitate others. For example, a Brahman who is in the mood of goodness is non-violent, whereas a Kshatriya who is in the mood of passion is allowed to be violent. As such, for a Kshatriya it is better to be vanquished following the rules of violence than to imitate a Brahman who follows the principles of non-violence. Everyone has to cleanse his heart by a gradual process, not abruptly. However, when principles of non-violence even has to cleanse his heart by a gradual process. However, when one transcends the moods of material nature and is fully situated in Krishna consciousness, he can perform anything and everything under the directions of a bona fide spiritual master. In that complete stage of Krishna consciousness, a Kshatriya may act as a Brahmin, or a Brahman may act as a Kshatriya. In the transcendental stage, the distinction of the material world do not apply. For example, Vaisnava was originally a Kshatriya, but later on he acted as a Brahman, whereas Parashurama was a Brahman, but later on he acted as a Kshatriya. Being transcendentally situated, they could do so, but as long as one is on the material platform, he must perform his duties according to the moods of material nature. At the same time, he must have a full sense of Krishna consciousness.
Okay. Okay, you can. All right. So, continuing from text 36. Arjuna uvacha atha kena prayuktvayam papam charati purusha anichan api varshneya balariva niyojita. Arjuna said, O descendant of Vrishni, by what is one impelled to sinful acts, even unwillingly, as if engaged by force? A living entity, as part and parcel of the Supreme, is originally pure. Is originally spiritual, pure, and free from all material contamination. Therefore, by nature, he is not subject to the sins of the material world. But when he is in contact with the material nature, he acts in many sinful ways without hesitation, and sometimes even against his will. As such, Arjuna's question to Krishna is very sanguine as to the perverted nature of the living entity. Although the living entity sometimes does not want to act in sin, he is still forced to act. Sinful actions are not, however, impelled by the supersoul within, but are due to another cause, as the Lord explains in the next verse. Text 37. Sri Bhagavan Uvacha Kama Esha Krodha Esha Raja Guna Samudbhava Mahashano Mahapapma Vidyenam Iha Vairinam. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, "It is lust only, Arjuna, which is born of contact with the material mode of passion, and later transformed into wrath, and which is the all-devouring sinful enemy of this world." Report. When a living entity comes in contact with the material creation, his eternal love for Krishna is transformed into lust in the association with the mode of passion. Or in other words, the sense of love of God becomes transformed into lust as milk in contact with sour tamarind is transformed into yogurt. Then again, when lust is unsatisfied, it turns into wrath. Wrath is transformed into illusion, and illusion continues the material existence. Therefore, lust is the greatest enemy of the living entity, and it is lust only which induces the pure living entity to remain entangled in the material world. Wrath is the manifestation of the mode of ignorance. These modes exhibit themselves as wrath and other corollaries. If therefore the mode of passion, instead of being degraded into the mode of ignorance, is elevated to the mode of goodness by the prescribed method of living and acting, then one can be saved from the degradation of wrath by spiritual attachment. The Supreme Personality of Godhead expanded himself into many for his ever-increasing spiritual bliss, and the living entities are parts and parcels of this spiritual bliss. They also have partial independence, but by misuse of their independence, when their service attitude is transformed into the propensity for sense enjoyment, they come under the sway of lust. This material creation is created by the Lord to give facility to the conditioned souls to fulfill these lustful propensities. And when completely baffled by prolonged lustful activities, the living entities began to inquire about their real position. The inquiry is the beginning of the Vedanta Sutras, where it is said, Atato Brahma Jigyasa. One should inquire into the Supreme, and the Supreme is defined in Srimad Bhagavatam as Janmadi Asya Yaton Vayad Itaratis, or the origin of everything is the Supreme Brahman. Therefore, the origin of lust is also the Supreme. If therefore lust is transformed into love for the Supreme, or transformed into Krishna consciousness, or in other words, desiring everything for Krishna, then both lust and wrath can be spiritualized. Hanuman, the great servant of Lord Ram, exhibited his wrath by burning the golden city of Ravan, but by doing so he became the greatest devotee of the Lord. Here also, in Bhagavad Gita, the Lord induces Arjuna to engage his wrath upon the enemies for the satisfaction of the Lord. Therefore, lust and wrath, when they are employed in Krishna consciousness, become our friends instead of our enemies. Text 38. Dhumena vriyate vanir yata darsho malena cha yatol bena vrito garbhas tata teni damavritam. As fire is covered by smoke, as a mirror is covered by dust, and as the embryo is covered by the womb, the living entity is similarly covered by different degrees of this lust. Purport. There are 3 degrees of covering of the living entity by which this pure consciousness is obscured. This covering is but lust under different manifestations, like smoke in the fire, dust on the mirror, and the womb about the embryo. When lust is compared to smoke, it is understood that the fire of the living spark can be a little perceived. In other words, when the living entity exhibits his Krishna consciousness slightly, he may be likened to the fire covered by smoke. Although fire is necessary where there is smoke, there is no overt manifestation of fire in the early stage. This stage is like the beginning of Krishna consciousness. The dust in the mirror refers to the cleansing process of the mirror of the mind by so many spiritual methods. The best process is to chant the holy names of the Lord. The embryo covered by the womb is an analogy illustrating a helpless position, for the child in the womb is so helpless that he cannot even move. This stage of living condition can be compared to that of the trees. The trees are also living entities, but they have been put in such a condition of life by such a great exhibition of lust that they are almost void of all consciousness. The covered mirror is compared to the birds and beasts, and the smoke-covered fire is compared to the human being. In the form of the human being, a living entity may revive a little Krishna consciousness, and if he makes further development, the fire of spiritual life can be kindled in the human form of life. By careful handling of the smoke in the fire can be made to blaze. Therefore, the human form of life is a chance for the living entity to escape the entanglement of material existence. In the human form of life, one can conquer the enemy, lust, by cultivation of Krishna consciousness under Eva guidance. All right. So, Mataji, you can go ahead and continue from text 39.
Avritam jnanam etena jnanina nitya vairina kamarupena kaunteya dispurena nalena cha. Thus, the wise living entity's pure consciousness becomes covered by his eternal enemy in the form of lust, which is never satisfied and which burns like fire. Purport. It is said in the Manusmriti that lust cannot be satisfied by any amount of sense enjoyment, just as fire is never extinguished by a constant supply of fuel. In the material world, the center of all activities is sex, and thus this material world is called Mindhunyagara, or the shakeless of sex life. In the ordinary prison house, criminals are kept within bars. Similarly, the criminals who are disobedient to the laws of the Lord are shackled by sex life and advancement of material civilization on the basis of sense gratification means increasing the duration of the material existence of a living entity. Therefore, this lust is the symbol of ignorance by which the living entity is kept within the material world. While one enjoys sense gratification, it may be that there is some feeling of happiness, but actually, that so-called feeling of happiness is the ultimate enemy of the sense enjoyer. Text 40. Indriyani mano buddhir asyat histhanam uchyate etair vimohayatyesa jnanam avritya dehinam. The senses, the mind, and the intelligence are the sitting places of the lust. Through them, lust covers the real knowledge of the living entity and bewilders him. Purport. The enemy has captured different strategic positions in the body of the conditioned soul. And therefore, Lord Krishna is giving hints of those places so that one who wants to conquer the enemy may know where he can be found. Mind is the center of all the activities of the senses, and thus, when we hear about sense objects, the mind generally becomes a reservoir of all ideas of sense gratification. And as a result, the mind and the senses become the repositories of lust. Next, the intelligence department becomes the capital of such lustful propensities. Intelligence is the immediate next door neighbor of the spirit soul. Lust intelligence influences the spirit soul to acquire the false ego and identify itself with matter, and thus with the mind and senses. The spirit soul becomes addicted to enjoying the material senses and mistakes this as true happiness. This false identification of the spirit soul is very nicely explained in the Srimad Bhagavatam 10:84-13. Yasyatma buddhir kunape trithatuke svathih kalatradishu blauma ijyathih yatirtha buddhih salyena karhichih janes abhije jnesu sa eva gokharach. A human being who identifies this body made of three elements with his self, who considers the byproducts of the body to be his kinsman, who considers the land of birth worshipable, and who goes to the places of pilgrimage simply to take a bath rather than meet men of transcendental knowledge there, is to be considered like an ass or a cow. Thank you very much. I will have to leave now. Hare Krishna. I will have to leave now the meeting.
That's fine.
Thank you.
Varun Prabhu, can you continue with text 41, please?
Text 41. Tasmatvam indriyani adau niyamya bharatarshava papnanam prajahi tena jnana nashanam. Therefore, O Arjun, best of the Bharatas, in the very beginning curb this great symbol of sin, lust, by regulating the senses, and slay this destroyer of knowledge and self-realization. Purport. The Lord advised Arjun to regulate the senses from the very beginning, so that he could curb the greatest sinful enemy, lust, which destroys the urge for self-realization and specific knowledge of the self. Jnana refers to the knowledge of self as distinguished from non-self, or in other words, knowledge that the spirit soul is not the body. Vijnana refers to specific knowledge of the spirit soul's constitutional position and his relationship to the Supreme Soul. It is explained thus in the Srimad Bhagavatam 2:9-31. Jnanam parama guhyam me yad vijnana samanvitam sarahasyam tad angam cha grihana gaditam maya. The knowledge of the self and the Supreme Self is very confidential and mysterious, but such knowledge and specific realization can be understood if explained with their various aspects by the Lord Himself. Bhagavad Gita gives us that general and specific knowledge of the self. The living entities are parts and parcels of the Lord, and therefore they are simply meant to serve the Lord. This consciousness is called Krishna consciousness. So, from the very beginning of life, one has to learn this Krishna consciousness, and thereby one may become fully Krishna conscious and act accordingly. Lust is only the perverted reflection of the love of God, which is natural for every living entity. But if one is educated in Krishna consciousness from the very beginning, that natural love of God cannot deteriorate into lust. When love of God deteriorates into lust, it is very difficult to return to the normal condition. Nonetheless, Krishna consciousness is so powerful that even a late beginner can become a lover of God by following the regulative principles of devotional service. So, from any stage of life or from the time of understanding its urgency, one can begin regulating the senses in Krishna consciousness, devotional service of the Lord, and turn the lust into love of Godhead, the highest perfectional stage of human life. Text 42. Indrani parani ahur indriyebhyah param manah manasastu para buddhir yo buddhe paratastu sa. The working senses are superior to dull matter. Mind is higher than the senses. Intelligence is still higher than the mind. And he, the soul, is even higher than the intelligence. Purport. The senses are different outlets for the activities of lust. Lust is reserved within the body, but it is given vent through the senses. Therefore, the senses are superior to the body as a whole. These outlets are not in use when there is superior consciousness or Krishna consciousness. In Krishna consciousness, the soul makes direct connection with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Therefore, the hierarchy of bodily functions as described here ultimately ends in the Supreme Soul. Bodily action means the functions of the senses, and stopping the senses means stopping all bodily actions. But since the mind is active, then even though the body may be silent and at rest, the mind will act, as it does during dreaming. But above the mind is the determination of the intelligence, and above the intelligence is the soul proper. If therefore the soul is directly engaged with the Supreme, naturally all other subordinates, namely the intelligence, mind, and senses, will be automatically engaged. In the Katha Upanishad, there is a similar passage in which it is said that the objects of sense gratification are superior to the senses, and mind is superior to the sense objects. If therefore the mind is directly engaged in the service of the Lord constantly, then there is no chance that the senses will become engaged in other ways. This mental attitude has already been explained. Param drishtva nivartate. If the mind is engaged in the transcendental service of the Lord, there is no chance of its being engaged in lower propensities. In the Katha Upanishad, the soul has been described as Mahan, the great. Therefore, the soul is above all, namely, the sense objects, the senses, the mind, and the intelligence. Therefore, directly understanding the constitutional position of the soul is the solution of the whole problem. With intelligence, one has to seek out the constitutional position of the soul and then engage the mind always in Krishna consciousness. That solves the whole problem. A neophyte spiritualist is generally advised to keep aloof from the objects of senses. But aside from that, one has to strengthen the mind by use of intelligence. If by intelligence one engages one's mind in Krishna consciousness, by complete surrender unto the Supreme Personality of Godhead, then automatically the mind becomes stronger, and even though the senses are very strong like serpents, they will be no more effective than serpents with broken fangs. But even though the soul is the master of the intelligence and mind, and the senses also, still unless it is strengthened by association with Krishna, In Krishna consciousness, there is every chance of falling down due to the agitated mind. Text 43. Evam buddhe param buddhva samstabhyatmanam atmana jahi shatrum mahabaho kamarupam durasadam. Thus, knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, mind, and intelligence, O mighty armed Arjun, one should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence, Krishna consciousness, and thus by spiritual strength conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. Purport: this third chapter of the Bhagavad Gita is conclusively directive to Krishna consciousness by knowing oneself as the eternal servitor of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, without considering impersonal voidness the ultimate end. In the material existence of life, one is certainly influenced by propensities for lust and desire, for dominating the resources of material nature. Desire for overlording and for sense gratification is the greatest enemy of the conditioned soul. But by the strength of the Krishna consciousness, one can control the material senses, the mind, and intelligence. One may not give up work and prescribed duties all of a sudden, but by gradually developing Krishna consciousness, one can be situated in a transcendental position without being influenced by the material senses and the mind. By steady intelligence directed towards one's pure identity. This is the sum total of this chapter. In the immature stage of material existence, philosophical speculation and artificial attempts to control the senses by the so-called practice of yogic postures can never help a man towards spiritual life. He must be trained in Krishna consciousness by higher intelligence. Thus ends the Bhakti Vedanta purports to the third chapter of the Srimad Bhagavad Gita in the matter of Karma Yoga, or the discharge of one's prescribed duty.
All right. So you can hold there, and Raghunandan, you can go ahead and start chapter 4.
Haribol,
Hare Krishna.
chapter 4, Transcendental Knowledge, text 1. Sri Bhagavanu Vacha Imam Vishvasvati Yugam Ruptavan Aham Avyayam Vishvasvan Manavi Praha Manu Isvakuvi Bhavit. Translation. The personality of Godhead, Lord Krishna said, I instructed this imperishable science of yoga to the sun god Vishvasvan. And Vishvasvan instructed it to Manu, the father of mankind. And Manu in turn instructed it to Ishvaku, purport. Here we find the history of the Bhagavad Gita traced from a remote time when it was delivered to the royal order of all planets, beginning from the sun planet. The kings of all planets are especially meant for the protection of the inhabitants. And therefore the royal order should understand the science of Bhagavad Gita in order to be able to rule the citizens and protect them from material bondage. Lust. Human life is meant for cultivation of spiritual knowledge in eternal relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And the executive heads of all states and all planets are obliged to impart this blessing to the citizens by education, culture, and devotion. In other words, the executive heads of all states are intended to spread the science of Krishna consciousness so that the people may take advantage of this great science and pursue a successful path utilizing the opportunity of the human form of life. In this millennium, the sun god is known as Vishvasvan, the king of the sun, which is the origins of all planets within the solar system. In the Brahma Samhita 5:52, it is stated, Yakcha Shu Isha Savita Sakala Grahanam Raja Samasta Suramuti Asisa Puja Yasyajnaya Brahmeti Samrita Kala Chatu Govindam Adipurusham Namaham Bhajami. Let me worship Lord Brahma. Let me worship Lord Brahma, said the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Govinda, Krishna, who is the original person under whose order the sun, which is the king of all planets, is assuming immense power and heat. The sun represents the eye of the Lord and traverses its orbit in obedience to his order. The sun is the king of all planets. The sun is the king of the planets, and the sun god at present of the name, the sun at present of the name Vaisnava rules the sun planet, which is controlling all other planets by supplying heat and light. He is rotating under the order of Krishna, and Lord Krishna originally made Vaisnava his first disciple to understand the science of Bhagavad Gita. The Gita is not therefore a speculative treatise for the insignificant mundane scholar, but is a standard book of knowledge coming down from time immemorial. In Mahabharata, Shanti Parva 348.51-52, we can trace out the history of the Gita as follows. Treta Yoga Docha Tatu Vizvansvamana Vidantu Manusha Luka Briti Atham Shutaye Svaka Vidadu Ikshvakuna Chakavitu Viyapya Lukam Avistitaha. In the beginning of the millennium known as Treta Yoga, the science of the relationship with the Supreme was delivered by Vaisnava to Manu. Manu, being the father of mankind, gave it to his son Maharaj Ishvaku, the king of this planet and forefathers of the Raghu dynasty, in which Lord Ramchandra appeared. Therefore, Bhagavad Gita existed in human society from the time of Maharaj Ishvaku.
All right.
At present moment,
all right. At the present moment, we have just passed through 5,000 years of Kali Yuga, which lasts 432,000 years. Before this, there was Dwapar, 800,000 years, and before that, Treta, 1,200,000 years. Thus, some 2,005,000 years ago, Manu spoke the Bhagavad Gita to his disciple and son, Maharaj Ikshvaku, the king of this planet Earth. The age of the current Manu is calculated to last some 305,300,000 years, of which 120,400,000 have passed. Accepting that before the birth of Manu, the Gita was spoken by the Lord to his disciple, the sun god Vivaswan, a rough estimate is that the Gita was spoken at least 120,400,000 years ago, and in human society it has been extant for 2 million years. It was re-spoken by the Lord again to Arjuna about 5,000 years ago. That is the rough estimate of the history of the Gita, according to the Gita itself, and according to the version of the speaker, Lord Sri Krishna. It was spoken to the sun god Vivaswan because he is also a Kshatriya and is the father of all Kshatriyas who are descendants of the sun god, or the Surya Vamsa Kshatriyas. Because Bhagavad Gita is as good as the Vedas, being spoken by the Supreme Personality of Godhead, this knowledge is apaurushaya, superhuman. Since the Vedic instructions are accepted as they are, without human interpretation, the Gita must therefore be accepted without mundane interpretation. The mundane wranglers may speculate on the Gita in their own ways, but that is not Bhagavad Gita as it is. Therefore, Bhagavad Gita has to be accepted as it is from the disciplic succession, and is therefore described herein that the Lord spoke to the sun god spoke to his son Manu, and Manu spoke to his son Ikshvaku. Alright, so we can stop here tonight. We'll continue with text 2. Okay, so we continue with text 2 tomorrow, so we're stopping at Bhagavad Gita 4, text 1. Alright, so basically what is described here is the appearance of the uncontrolled nature by the appearance of lust. Now it says, according to Srimad Bhagavatam, one who knows the absolute truth in 3 different features, namely Brahman, Paramatma, and the Supreme Personality of Godhead, he is called Tatvavit, for he knows his own factual position in relationship with the Supreme. But bewildered by the modes of material nature, the ignorant fully engage themselves in material activities and become attached. But here it is said the wise should not unsettle them, although these duties are inferior due to the performer's lack of knowledge. So everyone, according to his quality and position, has a particular type of work to discharge, and all such duties may be discharged in Krishna consciousness. That will lead one to the path of liberation. So, even though people are performing activities which are not Krishna conscious, we shouldn't condemn them and unsettle their minds. Otherwise, we won't be able to preach to them if we are too harsh with them. Now, an ordinary man with firm faith in the eternal injunctions of the Lord, even though unable to execute such orders, becomes liberated from the bondage of the law of karma. So, these persons who are great philosophers and great yogis, they might think they have the ability to understand the Lord. But here they said an ordinary man with firm faith in the eternal injunctions of the Lord, even though unable to execute such orders, he becomes liberated from the bondage of the law of karma. So in the beginning of Krishna consciousness, one may not fully discharge the injunction of the Lord, but because one is not resentful of this principle and works sincerely without consideration of defeat and hopelessness, he will surely be promoted to the stage of pure Krishna consciousness. So in spite of regulated sense enjoyment, there is every chance of falling down. Therefore, any attachment for regulated sense enjoyment must also be avoided by all means. But attachment to Krishna consciousness or acting always in the loving service of the Lord detaches one from all kinds of sensory activity. Therefore, no one should try to be detached from Krishna consciousness at any stage of life. The whole purpose of detachment from all kinds of sense attachment is ultimately to become situated on the platform of Krishna consciousness. So that's the purpose of detaching oneself, not so that we become powerful and great in society. When a living entity comes in contact with the material creation, his eternal love for Krishna is transformed into lust in association with the mode of passion. Or in other words, the sense of love of God becomes transformed into lust, as milk in contact with sour tamarind is transformed into yogurt. So the wise living entity's pure consciousness becomes covered by his eternal enemy in the form of lust, which is never satisfied and which burns like fire. And then it mentions that from lust comes anger, and from anger comes the bewilderment of memory, and so this is the process. And from bewilderment of memory, one falls down into the material pool. So when one enjoys sense gratification, it may be that there's some feeling of happiness, but actually that so-called feeling of happiness is the ultimate enemy of the sense enjoyer, because it drags one down to materialistic activities and lust. So the senses, the mind, and the intelligence are the sitting places of this lust, and through them lust covers the real knowledge of the living entity. It is said that intelligence is the immediate next door neighbor of the spirit soul, and lusty intelligence influences the spirit soul to acquire the false ego and identify himself with matter, thus with the mind and senses. The spirit soul becomes addicted to enjoying the material senses and mistakes this as true happiness. So, he's telling Arjuna, O best of the Bharatas, in the very beginning, curb this great symbol of sin, lust, by regulating the senses and slay the destroyer of knowledge and self-realization. And jnana refers to knowledge of the self as distinguished from the non-self, or in other words, knowledge of the spirit soul, not being the body. Jnana refers to specific knowledge of the spirit soul's constitutional position and his relationship with Krishna. So, with intelligence, one has to seek out the constitutional position of the soul and then engage his mind always in Krishna consciousness, and this will solve the whole problem of material attachment. So the next chapter is transcendental knowledge, and first of all we're hearing how this knowledge came down. So we can stop here, and does anyone have any comments, questions, or realizations on the subject matter?
One comment like that part which you also just summarized, that the sense enjoyment, it is actually the senses can never be satisfied, and then as soon as you start doing the sense enjoyment, then the lust and then the anger, bewilderment, illusion, that whole cycle starts. So if only we can keep remembering that, that to engage the senses in Krishna consciousness, if and that too, I think I get that point of being not to do that without envy, because I think because we have been so used to seeing ourselves being the enjoyers, right? But that is the false position, and whereas the true position is Lord Krishna is the supreme enjoyer. So yeah, so if those things one can keep remembering, then I think that will help a lot.
That is very good, and the living entity can never really enjoy the material world. Actually, Prahlad Maharaj says, from the time you desire happiness, that's when your misery begins. That's when your suffering begins. So that's basically what it is. So we can't enjoy here, but we're trying to enjoy as much as possible. And so the Vedas give us the ability to enjoy and in the material world and finally go back to the spiritual world. So we can do that if we follow the injunctions of the Vedas. But most people are not following the injunctions of the Vedas, they're following sense gratification. But still, as is mentioned, we should not unsettle their minds and try to, make them feel guilty and sinful. What we should do is somehow or the other try to engage them in the process of devotional service. So,
one thing that must follow that, since Lord Krishna himself says this place is Dukhale, and then as you just said, Prahlad Maharaj said, the moment you start desiring happiness, that's when your misery starts. So in actuality, all the people around us must be in miserable condition. It's just that all this, I mean, this thing that they keep showing in the society, how people are enjoying these symbols of happiness that they have created, these must be false then. I mean, these people everybody must be miserable, I would think, in those who are trying to enjoy material happiness. Is that not the case?
they're actually miserable, right? But what's happening is that false sense of happiness. You see, because uh, in material activity, there is some kind of happiness, right? It says while one enjoys sense gratification, it may be that there's some feeling about happiness, but actually, a so-called feeling of happiness is the ultimate enemy of the sense enjoyer.
Right.
this is what happens. It creates the opposite effect, that we do not love the Lord, and then we can't become we can't become tatvavit. We can't actually understand our factual position and relationship with the Lord. So if we don't understand that, we're making a mistake in any case. All right, so they're making a mistake, but they're satisfied somehow or the other in that it's only when they have difficulty that's when they cry out to the Lord, but not before. But the intelligent man, he tries to cry out to the Lord at all times because he knows that the Lord is the giver of everything and is a person who should actually be served and be satisfied. So we perform our activity to satisfy the Lord, not for any other reason. And that's why the material world is so filled up. And so the Kali Yuga is progressing, and we can see changes taking place, So, but there is a little eddy against that, which is the Krishna consciousness movement, which is supposed to last approximately 10,000 years. So it should get better for a while, and then after that, Kali Yuga will come in full force. So Prabhupada says we should try as much as possible to get out as soon as we can. All right, so we can stop here tonight, and Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Kara Premanandi Hari Hari Bol.